In the vast expanse of the Pacific Theater during the summer of 1942, the strategic landscape was rapidly shifting beneath the feet of the Allied forces. The Imperial Japanese High Command, relentlessly pursuing total dominance in the region, identified a critical vulnerability in the Allied defensive perimeter. Their primary objective became the vital coastal town of Port Moresby, situated on the southern coast of the largely unexplored island of New Guinea. Capturing this strategic port would effectively sever the crucial maritime supply lines between the United States and the increasingly isolated Australian continent. The initial Japanese plan to seize Port Moresby relied entirely on an ambitious amphibious assault, a strategy that had yielded immense success in their previous conquests. However, this maritime operation was abruptly halted in early May 1942 during the historic Battle of the Coral Sea. Although tactically ambiguous, the naval engagement forced the Japanese invasion fleet to turn back, marking the first time their seemingly invincible offensive momentum was checked. Undeterred by this naval setback, the Japanese military leadership immediately formulated an audacious alternative plan to achieve their vital strategic objective through an overland campaign. This revised operational directive demanded an amphibious landing on the northern shores of Papua, followed by a grueling march across the formidable Owen Stanley Range to strike Port Moresby from the rear. To execute this exceptionally demanding task, the Japanese command selected the elite South Seas Detachment. This battle-hardened force was placed under the meticulous leadership of Major General Tomataro Hori. Hori was a seasoned and fiercely disciplined commander, highly respected by his superiors for his tactical acumen and his unwavering dedication to the martial ethos of the formidable Imperial Japanese Army. On the dark evening of the 21st of July 1942, the vanguard of Hori's forces successfully executed surprise landings at the northern coastal villages of Buna, Gona, and Sanananda. The initial disembarkation encountered virtually no resistance, allowing the Japanese engineers to rapidly establish robust beachheads and logistical bases. General Hori stepped onto the muddy shores with supreme confidence, issuing immediate orders to secure the forward staging areas. He commanded his officers to prepare the men for a rapid, relentless advance inland, firmly believing that speed and shock action would overwhelm any disorganized Allied opposition. Meanwhile, deep within the corridors of Allied command, a catastrophic failure of military intelligence was unfolding. Senior officers consistently underestimated both the size of the Japanese landing force and their formidable capability to traverse the treacherous terrain of the Owen Stanley Range. The prevailing geographical assessments categorized the mountainous interior as completely impassable to a modern, heavily equipped army. Consequently, the Allied leadership stationed in Australia fundamentally misread the immense gravity of the situation, dismissing the northern landings as merely a localized raid rather than the opening phase of a major continental invasion. To counter the perceived minor threat on the northern coast, the Australian military command dispatched a profoundly inadequate force known as the Maroubra Force. Initially, this defensive detachment was primarily composed of the 39th Infantry Battalion. Crucially, these troops were not seasoned veterans of the overseas campaigns in Europe or North Africa. Instead, they were incredibly young, inexperienced militiamen, many of whom had been hastily conscripted, often referred to derisively as chokos, a term implying they would melt like chocolate under the intense heat of battle. These boys were tragically unprepared. These young Australian conscripts possessed minimal combat training, and their logistical support was woefully inadequate for the punishing realities of jungle warfare. Armed with antiquated weapons and lacking essential medical supplies, they were ordered to advance into the dense, suffocating canopy of the Kokoda Track to halt the encroaching enemy. The soldiers trudged forward with a mixture of nervous anticipation and grim determination. "Keep your eyes on the tree line and your rifles ready," a junior lieutenant whispered to his trembling platoon, attempting to instill a fragile sense of courage among the frightened teenagers. General Hori, entirely unaware of the meager quality of the forces opposing him, systematically consolidated his bridgehead and initiated the overland advance. His veteran soldiers, hardened by years of brutal conflict in China and across the Pacific Islands, moved with practiced efficiency. They carried heavy packs filled with rice, ammunition, and specialized equipment designed for mountain assaults. The Japanese troops were heavily conditioned to endure severe physical hardship and to obey orders without hesitation, making them a spectacularly lethal force, perfectly suited for the unforgiving environment they were about to ruthlessly conquer. The initial miles of the Japanese advance inland were deceptively manageable, traversing relatively flat coastal plains and swampy lowlands. However, as Hori's vanguard approached the foothills of the Owen Stanley Range, the geography transformed into a terrifyingly vertical nightmare. The trail narrowed into a muddy, root-choked path that clung precariously to the sides of sheer ravines. Despite the suddenly agonizing terrain, Hori demanded maximum speed from his subordinate commanders. He understood that achieving operational surprise was paramount to penetrating the mountain passes before the Allies could significantly reinforce their defensive positions. As the Japanese spearhead plunged deeper into the dense rainforest, the climate became an oppressive, invisible. The extreme humidity and suffocating heat drained the soldiers' stamina with every agonizing step they took up the steep inclines. Torrential downpours, a daily occurrence in the Papuan jungle, turned the narrow track into a treacherous, sliding river of deep mud. Pack animals utilized by the Japanese quickly faltered and died, forcing the infantrymen to shoulder even heavier burdens. Yet, driven by fierce discipline, they relentlessly pushed forward toward the critical mountain village of Kokoda. Ahead of the advancing Japanese juggernaut, the young soldiers of the Australian 39th Battalion struggled just to survive the grueling march from Port Moresby. The physical toll of navigating the treacherous Kokoda Track was immediate and devastating to the inexperienced militiamen. Without proper jungle footwear or adequate waterproof gear, their uniforms quickly rotted, and debilitating foot infections became rampant. Supply lines consisting of indigenous Papuan carriers were stretched to their absolute breaking point, meaning the terrified Australian teenagers frequently faced days without sufficient rations, clean drinking water, or essential anti-malarial medication. Despite their rapidly deteriorating physical condition and profound lack of combat experience, the Australian militiamen established rudimentary defensive perimeters near the vital airstrip at Kokoda. The strategic significance of this small plateau was immense. It represented the only viable location in the mountains to land, transport aircraft for resupply or medical evacuation. Holding Kokoda was absolutely imperative to slowing the Japanese advance. The young conscripts feverishly dug shallow trenches in the thick mud, peering anxiously into the dark, impenetrable wall of green jungle, acutely aware that an unseen enemy was approaching. Back at the Allied headquarters, a dangerous atmosphere of complacency continued to dominate the strategic planning. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, remained stubbornly convinced that the Owen Stanley Range was an impenetrable barrier. He issued directives from the comfort of his distant office, consistently demanding aggressive offensive action from the isolated troops on the track. MacArthur and his staff completely failed to comprehend the logistical impossibility of launching a massive counterattack across the highest and most treacherous mountain range in the theater. The disconnect between the comfortable command centers and the brutal reality of the jungle front lines was a profound failure of military leadership. While staff officers scrutinized pristine topographical maps in brightly lit rooms, the actual soldiers on the ground were fighting a desperate battle for mere survival against the elements. The Australian militiamen felt entirely abandoned by their higher command. "They have absolutely no bloody idea what we are facing up here," a weary sergeant muttered bitterly to his squad as they huddled beneath a makeshift shelter during a violent tropical thunderstorm. By the final days of July 1942, the inevitable and violent collision between these two vastly different military forces was imminent. General Hori's vanguard, having successfully navigated the initial foothills, finally approached the outskirts of Kokoda village. The Japanese scouts, moving silently through the dense foliage, reported the presence of the Australian defensive positions. Hori, sensing a rapid victory, ordered his elite assault troops to prepare for an immediate nighttime offensive. He intended to crush the inexperienced defenders with a swift, overwhelming display of superior firepower and aggressive close-quarters combat tactics. As darkness enveloped the jungle, the terrifying silence was shattered by the sharp crack of Japanese rifle fire and the devastating explosion of mortar shells. The young Australians of the 39th Battalion, facing their very first taste of mortal combat, were abruptly thrust into a terrifying, chaotic nightmare. The highly trained Japanese infantry utilized the thick jungle cover expertly, executing rapid flanking maneuvers to encircle the terrified militiamen. The deafening roar of automatic weapons and the screams of wounded men echoed through the deep valleys as the battle for Kokoda officially commenced. Despite the overwhelming numerical superiority and tactical brilliance of the attacking Japanese forces, the deeply terrified Australian conscripts fought back with a shocking degree of desperate tenacity. Fighting entirely from shallow, muddy rifle pits, they unleashed sporadic but fierce defensive fire into the shadows. The sheer shock of the initial Japanese assault caused temporary disarray, but the young boys refused to completely break and run. They clung to their precarious positions with grim determination, acutely aware that yielding the vital airstrip would grant the enemy a massive logistical advantage in the mountains. The Japanese commanders, initially expecting the poorly trained militia to instantly dissolve under pressure, were mildly surprised by the stubborn pocket of resistance. However, General Hori simply committed more veteran troops to the ongoing engagement, determined to ruthlessly crush the defenders through sheer attrition. He orchestrated coordinated artillery bombardments that rained highly destructive shrapnel down upon the fragile Australian trenches. The relentless pressure slowly began to fracture the Australian defensive perimeter, forcing the heavily outnumbered and severely exhausted militiamen to gradually yield valuable ground in the chaotic aftermath of the initial clashes around Kokoda. It became agonizingly clear to the local Australian commanders that their position was entirely untenable. Faced with total annihilation by a vastly superior and combat-hardened enemy force, the agonizing decision was made to execute a tactical withdrawal. The young soldiers, carrying their wounded comrades on their backs, began a desperate fighting retreat deeper into the unforgiving mountains. They left the strategically vital Kokoda airstrip firmly in the hands of General Hori, who now possessed a clear, unimpeded path toward the heart of Papua. As July came to a bloody and disastrous close, the strategic situation for the Allied forces in the Pacific had deteriorated at an alarming rate. The Imperial Japanese Army had successfully established a formidable foothold on the northern coast and had easily brushed aside the initial Australian resistance. General Hori's elite South Seas detachment was now marching relentlessly toward Port Moresby, fueled by absolute confidence and martial pride. The horrific reality of the Kokoda Track campaign was only just beginning, promising unprecedented suffering for every single soldier trapped within its green hell. As August of 1942 dawned over the jagged peaks of the Owen Stanley Range, the grim reality of the Kokoda campaign materialized. The environment immediately established itself as the most formidable adversary for both the retreating Australians and the advancing Japanese forces. The Kokoda Track was not merely a path, but a treacherous, suffocating green hell of nearly vertical ascents and plunging, muddy ravines. Dense canopy blocked out the sun, trapping a stifling malarial humidity that drained the physical and mental reserves of every soldier who dared to traverse its unforgiving length. The physical exertion required simply to put one foot in front of the other was unimaginably severe. Soldiers carrying heavy packs, weapons, and ammunition struggled up the steep, root-tangled inclines, frequently slipping back into the deep, clinging mud. Torrential afternoon downpours instantly transformed the narrow trail into a raging torrent of brown water, washing away footholds and equipment. It is like climbing a greased pole in the dark while someone pours buckets of slush over your head, a young Australian militiaman whispered, his voice trembling from absolute exhaustion and cold. Beyond the punishing terrain, the microscopic enemies of the jungle inflicted devastating casualties upon the ranks of both armies. The stagnant pools and relentless dampness provided the perfect breeding ground for disease. Debilitating strains of malaria swept through the exhausted platoons, causing men to collapse in shivering fits of high fever and delirium. Furthermore, the complete lack of sanitary conditions rapidly led to virulent outbreaks of dysentery. This terrible affliction stripped the soldiers of their remaining strength, leaving hundreds of men violently ill and physically unable to continue the grueling march. Recognizing the rapidly deteriorating situation and the imminent collapse of the inexperienced militia forces, the Australian High Command desperately sought experienced leadership. Brigadier Arnold Potts, a battle-hardened veteran of the Middle East campaigns, was urgently dispatched to take command of the beleaguered Maroubra force. Potts arrived on the track with a pragmatic and sober understanding of modern warfare, yet even he was profoundly shocked by the horrifying condition of his new troops. He found a ragged, starving, and disease-ridden assembly of young men desperately trying to hold an impossible defensive line. Brigadier Potts immediately conducted a stark assessment of the tactical reality facing his drastically outnumbered forces. He quickly realized that the Japanese South Seas Detachment possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers, firepower, and jungle combat experience. "We cannot hold them in a static defense, boys. We must trade space for time," Potts told his exhausted officers during a tense command briefing in a muddy dugout. He understood that a rigid defensive posture would result in the complete annihilation of the Maroubra force by Major General Hori's highly aggressive and mobile infantry units. To preserve his fragile command, Potts brilliantly orchestrated a complex and agonizing fighting withdrawal down the mountainous spine of the Kokoda Track. This strategy required his men to establish temporary defensive perimeters, inflict maximum casualties upon the advancing Japanese vanguard, and then disengage before being completely enveloped. It was a terrifyingly delicate operation, demanding immense discipline from terrified teenagers who were constantly under intense enemy fire. The Australian soldiers had to retreat backward through the treacherous mud, dragging their wounded comrades and abandoning heavy equipment to maintain their crucial mobility. In stark contrast, Major General Hori's veteran soldiers pushed forward with seemingly unstoppable momentum, fueled by their initial victories and strict imperial discipline. The Japanese infantry proved themselves to be absolute masters of jungle warfare, utilizing the dense undergrowth to conceal their rapid movements. Instead of launching costly frontal assaults against the entrenched Australian rearguard, the Japanese commanders consistently employed highly aggressive flanking maneuvers. They would stealthily hack their way through the supposedly impenetrable jungle alongside the track, silently enveloping the Australian defensive pockets before launching devastating, coordinated surprise attacks. This relentless flanking strategy created a pervasive atmosphere of psychological terror among the retreating Australian militiamen. The constant threat of being surrounded and cut off from their solitary supply line amplified the already immense stress of the campaign. The thick jungle canopy heavily obscured visibility, making it nearly impossible to determine the size or exact location of the attacking Japanese units. "They are like bloody ghosts in the trees. You never see them until they are right on top of you," a frantic Australian corporal yelled as a sudden ambush erupted. The logistical nightmare of supplying the retreating Maroubra force severely compounded Brigadier Potts's mounting tactical difficulties. The sole method of delivering essential ammunition, food, and medical supplies to the frontline troops relied entirely on the heroic efforts of the indigenous Papuan carriers. These brave local men, affectionately and respectfully known as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, performed miraculous feats of endurance. They carried heavy supply crates up the treacherous slopes and then gently bore the critically wounded Australian soldiers back down the perilous track toward the relative safety of Port Moresby. However, the terrible conditions of the Kokoda Track inflicted a tremendous physical toll upon the Papuan carriers as well. Desertions occurred as the sheer brutality of the labor and the terrifying proximity of the combat became overwhelming. The rapidly extending supply line grew increasingly fragile as Potts's men were forced further back into the rugged mountains. Australian soldiers were frequently forced to fight on desperately reduced rations, scrounging for whatever meager sustenance they could find in the inhospitable rainforest, while fighting off continuous waves of Japanese infantry assaults. Concurrently, despite their impressive tactical successes and rapid territorial gains, the Japanese forces were beginning to experience their own severe logistical vulnerabilities. Major General Hori had boldly gambled on a swift, decisive victory, assuming his troops could primarily sustain themselves by capturing Allied supply dumps. As the Australian forces systematically destroyed their abandoned provisions during the fighting retreat, the Japanese supply chain stretched precariously thin across the grueling mountain passes. The advancing Imperial soldiers were soon placed on strictly reduced rice rations, subtly foreshadowing the catastrophic starvation that awaited them. The relentless Japanese pursuit forced a significant and bloody confrontation at the small village of Daniki, located just south of Kokoda. Here, the exhausted remnants of the Australian 39th Battalion attempted to establish a firm defensive line to briefly halt the enemy advance. The Japanese infantry, utilizing their heavy machine guns and mortars with deadly precision, launched a series of ferocious nighttime assaults against the precarious Australian positions. The dark jungle was entirely illuminated by the terrifying, continuous flashes of explosive ordnance and tracer fire tearing through the thick canopy. Despite fighting with profound courage and inflicting surprisingly heavy casualties upon the seasoned attackers, The sheer numerical weight of the Japanese forces eventually overwhelmed the defenders at णing. Hori's flanking units successfully infiltrated the dense jungle perimeter, threatening to completely sever the Australian avenue of retreat. Recognizing the imminent disaster, Brigadier Potts decisively ordered another agonizing withdrawal, pulling his battered troops further up the incredibly steep, muddy inclines toward the strategically vital high ground of Isurava. The loss of णing further cemented Japanese dominance over the northern section of the track. As the exhausted Australian militiamen trudged desperately toward Isurava, their physical and psychological resilience reached an absolute breaking point. The men were starving, suffering from severe tropical diseases, and deeply traumatized by the unrelenting ferocity of the continuous combat. Many soldiers lacked proper footwear, their boots completely rotting away in the pervasive dampness, forcing them to walk barefoot over sharp rocks and agonizingly exposed tree roots. Yet, driven by the sheer primal will to survive, they somehow continued to drag themselves up the treacherous, seemingly endless mountain trail. General Hori, observing the chaotic Australian retreat, remained supremely confident in the ultimate success of his ambitious campaign. He relentlessly pushed his vanguard commanders to maintain maximum pressure on the fleeing enemy, forbidding them from granting the Australians any opportunity to rest or consolidate their defensive lines. The Japanese soldiers, despite their own mounting fatigue and diminishing rations, obeyed with terrifying fanaticism. They maintained a punishing pace, constantly harassing the Australian rearguard with deadly sniper fire and sudden, vicious skirmishes that further depleted the fragile strength of the Maroubra force. However, a crucial shift in the balance of power was quietly taking place as the month of August wore on. Recognizing the desperate severity of the crisis, the Australian High Command finally authorized the deployment of veteran Australian Imperial Force units to the Kokoda Track. These highly experienced soldiers, returning from the brutal combat theaters of the Middle East, were rapidly rushed to the front lines. They began the grueling ascent from Port Moresby, marching with grim determination to relieve the desperately exhausted militiamen who had heroically borne the initial onslaught. The impending arrival of these battle-hardened veterans provided a crucial, albeit incredibly fragile, psychological boost to the decimated ranks of the Maroubra force. The young, terrified conscripts, who had fought a seemingly hopeless delaying action for weeks, finally dared to hope for salvation. "Hold the line just a little longer, lads. The real army is coming up the hill to help us." A battered captain encouraged his exhausted company, trying to steady their shattered nerves as yet another aggressive Japanese patrol probed their muddy, hastily constructed defensive perimeter. By the end of August, the retreating Australian forces finally reached the commanding heights of Isurava. Brigadier Potts recognized that this specific geographical choke point offered the best possible terrain to finally halt the relentless Japanese advance. The deep ravines and steep ridges severely limited Hori's ability to execute his highly effective flanking maneuvers. Potts ordered his exhausted men to immediately dig deep into the unforgiving mud and prepare for a massive, decisive confrontation. The desperate fighting retreat was temporarily over. At Isurava, the Maroubra force would finally stand its ground. As the elite Japanese South Seas Detachment confidently approached the heavily fortified Australian positions at Isurava, the horrific Kokoda Campaign entered its most violent and bloody phase. The unforgiving green hell of the jungle had already claimed countless lives through disease, starvation, and exhaustion, but the sheer brutality of the impending infantry battle would surpass all previous horrors. The exhausted militiamen, now bolstered by the arriving veterans, braced themselves for the ultimate test of survival against an enemy that still firmly believed in its own absolute, divine invincibility. The humid air hung heavy with the terrifying anticipation of the impending slaughter. Major General Hori, completely unfazed by his drastically overextended supply lines, methodically gathered his veteran assault battalions for a massive, coordinated strike designed to shatter the Australian defenses once and for all. The fate of Port Moresby, and potentially the entire Australian mainland, now precariously hinged upon the upcoming brutal clash of arms amidst the suffocating mud and rain-soaked ridges of Isurava. The stage was tragically set for one of the most desperate battles of the Pacific theater. The profound courage displayed by the native Papuan carriers during this agonizing buildup cannot be overstated by any serious military historian. Without their incredible physical endurance and deep compassion, the Australian casualty rate would have been catastrophic. They navigated the treacherous, mud-slick slopes while carrying heavy stretchers, often singing softly to comfort the desperately wounded and dying soldiers. Their selfless dedication forged a powerful, enduring bond between the native population and the Australian troops, a rare glimmer of profound humanity amidst the overwhelming savagery and horror of the relentless jungle conflict. As the dark clouds gathered heavily over the Owen Stanley Range, signaling the imminent arrival of yet another torrential downpour, the two exhausted armies finally faced each other across the deep ravines of Isurava. The deafening silence of the dense rainforest was only broken by the occasional, terrifying crack of a sniper's rifle. Both Brigadier Potts and General Horry clearly understood that the ensuing battle would irrevocably determine the ultimate outcome of the entire Kokoda campaign. The green hell had thoroughly tested them. Now, the true slaughter was about to begin. The critical juncture of the Kokoda campaign arrived in late August 1942 at the imposing defensive positions of Isurava. Brigadier Potts finally received his desperately needed reinforcements as the battle-hardened veterans of the Australian Imperial Force, specifically the 2 over 14th and 2 over 16th battalions, reached the front lines. These elite soldiers had recently returned from the searing deserts of the Middle East and were now thrust into the suffocating, malaria-infested jungles of Papua. Their timely arrival provided an immense psychological and tactical boost to the exhausted militiamen who had been fighting a relentless retreating action. The stark visual contrast between the newly arrived AIF veterans and the battered remnants of the 39th Battalion was profoundly jarring. The seasoned soldiers marched into the muddy perimeter carrying well-maintained weapons, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. Conversely, the young conscripts were emaciated, covered in infected sores, and shivering violently from relentless bouts of malaria. "You boys have done a bloody magnificent job holding them off. Go get some rest." A veteran AIF sergeant gently instructed a hollow-eyed teenager who was miraculously still clutching his heavily rusted Lee Enfield rifle. Unfazed by the reinforcement of the Australian lines, Major General Tomitaro Horry aggressively deployed his South Seas detachment for a massive frontal and flanking assault. Utilizing the dense jungle canopy to mask their tactical movements, the elite Japanese infantry units systematically probed the Australian perimeter for any exploitable weakness. The terrifying silence of the mist-shrouded mountain morning was violently shattered by the deafening roar of concentrated mortar barrages and the relentless chatter of heavy machine guns. Horry was absolutely determined to decisively break the Australian resistance and completely clear the path to Port Moresby. The ensuing Battle of Isurava degenerated into an unimaginably brutal spectacle of close-quarters combat amidst the clinging mud and torrential rain. The Japanese infantry, screaming fearsome battle cries, launched repeated suicidal charges against the heavily fortified Australian machine gun emplacements. The incredibly dense foliage rendered long-range marksmanship entirely impossible, forcing desperate men into horrific hand-to-hand struggles utilizing bayonets, entrenching tools, and bare fists. The muddy trenches quickly filled with the bodies of the fallen from both sides, creating a gruesome obstacle course for the surviving combatants. Amidst the overwhelming chaos and terrifying carnage, numerous acts of extraordinary, desperate heroism were recorded on both sides of the fierce engagement. Private Bruce Kingsbury of the AIF, witnessing a critical breach in the defensive line, grabbed a Bren light machine gun and charged directly into the advancing Japanese ranks. Firing from the hip with devastating accuracy, he single-handedly halted the enemy momentum before being tragically struck down by a hidden sniper's bullet. His incredible sacrifice temporarily stabilized the shattered perimeter, demonstrating the sheer ferocity and unyielding resolve of the Australian defenders. Despite the ferocious and highly effective Australian resistance, the inescapable reality of superior Japanese numbers gradually began to dictate the flow of the battle. General Horry masterfully utilized his veteran mountain troops to execute incredibly wide, exhausting flanking maneuvers through the seemingly impenetrable jungle terrain. These specialized Japanese units silently hacked their way through thick vegetation, completely bypassing the heavily defended central ridges. By threatening to sever the solitary Australian supply trail situated firmly to the rear, Horry systematically forced Brigadier Potts into an increasingly precarious and ultimately untenable strategic situation. Faced with the imminent threat of total encirclement and the complete annihilation of his entire command, Brigadier Potts was forced to make a profoundly agonizing tactical decision. Recognizing that holding Isurava would ultimately result in the destruction of the Maroubra force, he pragmatically ordered another fighting withdrawal. This highly controversial mandate required his exhausted soldiers to silently disengage from the fierce combat under the terrifying cover of absolute darkness. Leaving behind their unburied dead and deeply grieving, the battered Australian battalions slowly retreated further down the treacherous, mud-slicked spine of the Kokoda Track. The desperate retreat from Isurava immediately descended into a chaotic and highly dangerous logistical nightmare for the severely depleted Australian forces. The men were forced to fight continuous, brutal rearguard actions against the relentlessly pursuing Japanese vanguard while simultaneously navigating the impossibly steep descent toward Aora Creek. The treacherous, narrow path became choked with heavily laden stretchers, forcing the walking wounded to stagger forward unassisted through the freezing, knee-deep mud. "Keep moving, lads, or the bastards will absolutely overrun us by morning," an exhausted lieutenant repeatedly urged his heavily traumatized and starving platoon. While Brigadier Potts was masterfully executing a brilliant tactical withdrawal to preserve his fragile army, he faced intense and completely unwarranted criticism from his superiors, General Douglas MacArthur and General Thomas Blamey. Comfortably situated in their secure headquarters, far removed from the jungle slaughter, viewed the continuous retreats as a catastrophic failure of courage. They harshly condemned Potts, utterly failing to comprehend the overwhelming Japanese numerical superiority and the horrifying realities of mountain warfare. The profound disconnect between the high command and the frontline troops severely damaged morale during the darkest days. As the Australian forces systematically traded valuable space for critical time, the advancing Japanese war machine began to expose its own fatal vulnerabilities. Major General Hori's rapid, relentless pursuit had successfully driven the enemy back, but it had entirely outpaced his desperately fragile logistical supply lines. The rugged, muddy terrain proved highly unforgiving to the Japanese porters, and their meager rice rations were rapidly dwindling under the intense physical strain. The elite Imperial soldiers, despite their formidable combat prowess and unwavering discipline, were slowly beginning to starve amidst the lush, unforgiving jungle environment. By early September 1942, the severely battered Maroubra force hastily established a new, highly concentrated defensive perimeter at the prominent geographical feature known as Brigade Hill. Brigadier Potts intelligently consolidated his remaining veteran battalions on this strategically elevated position, desperately hoping to inflict catastrophic casualties upon the dangerously overextended Japanese supply lines. The Australian soldiers frantically dug deep trenches into the rocky soil, acutely aware that another massive enemy assault was utterly inevitable. The suffocating jungle humidity hung heavily over the tense encampment as the exhausted men silently awaited the terrifying onslaught. General Hori, recognizing the formidable strength of the Australian positions atop Brigade Hill, characteristically opted against launching a direct, highly costly frontal assault. Instead, he brilliantly orchestrated his most complex and devastating flanking maneuver of the entire jungle campaign. Utilizing the dense canopy for complete concealment, 3 seasoned Japanese battalions silently infiltrated the steep ravines surrounding the deeply entrenched Australian forces. Under the terrifying cover of a pitch-black, violently stormy night, the Imperial troops flawlessly maneuvered into positions that completely severed the vital communications and supply lines linking the scattered Australian headquarters. The meticulously planned Japanese offensive at Brigade Hill erupted with shocking, unprecedented violence just as the dawn light struggled to penetrate the thick jungle canopy. The Australian perimeter was suddenly engulfed in a terrifying maelstrom of accurate mortar fire and coordinated infantry assaults from multiple, unexpected directions. The highly segmented Australian defensive positions found themselves completely isolated from one another, desperately fighting desperate, uncoordinated battles for pure survival. The deafening cacophony of relentless automatic weapons fire and horrific, close-quarters screams echoed endlessly through the deep, misty valleys of the Owen Stanley Range. The absolute brilliance of the Japanese flanking maneuver became terrifyingly apparent when their elite assault troops unexpectedly attacked the highly vulnerable Australian Brigade headquarters. Clerks, cooks, and medical personnel were abruptly forced into brutal, hand-to-hand combat to desperately defend the crucial command center against the screaming Imperial infantry. Brigadier Potts found himself completely cut off from his frontline fighting battalions. his intricate defensive strategy entirely shattered by Hori's masterful infiltration tactics. The command structure of the Maroubra force effectively collapsed amidst the sheer, bloody chaos of the relentless, heavily coordinated Japanese jungle assault. Faced with total annihilation and the complete collapse of his centralized command, Brigadier Potts was forced to authorize a desperate, entirely disorganized breakout. The isolated Australian battalions, realizing they were heavily surrounded and rapidly running out of ammunition, fiercely hacked their way through the dense undergrowth to escape the tightening Japanese perimeter. Small, highly fragmented groups of exhausted soldiers navigated the treacherous, steeply plunging ravines, constantly hunted by aggressive enemy patrols. The disastrous engagement at Brigade Hill represented the lowest, most terrifying tactical point for the deeply demoralized Australian forces during the campaign. Major General Hori had undeniably secured another brilliant tactical victory at Brigade Hill, firmly forcing the shattered Australian army into yet another chaotic, desperate retreat. However, the continuous, incredibly intense combat operations were inflicting a horrific, entirely unsustainable toll upon his elite South Seas detachment. The relentless Australian rearguard actions, combined with the devastating effects of rampant tropical diseases, had severely decimated the highly experienced Japanese infantry ranks. Furthermore, the complete collapse of their logistical supply chain meant that the victorious Imperial soldiers were now forced to consume strictly rationed, deeply inadequate handfuls of rice. As the fragmented remnants of the Maroubra force staggered blindly backward toward Iorabaiwa, the strategic panic within the Allied High Command reached highly unprecedented levels. General Hori's seemingly unstoppable forces had successfully pushed the fiercely defending Australians almost entirely out of the treacherous mountain range. The terrifying prospect of a fully equipped Japanese army seizing the critical port facilities at Moresby and subsequently launching direct, devastating aerial attacks against the Australian mainland was now a highly realistic, nightmare scenario. Public anxiety in major Australian cities surged dramatically as the dark news spread. In a highly controversial and deeply unjust political maneuver, General Blamey officially relieved Brigadier Potts of his frontline command in the immediate aftermath of Brigade Hill. Blamey, desperately seeking a convenient scapegoat for the continued military failures, unfairly blamed Potts for the relentless series of highly necessary tactical withdrawals. This shocking dismissal deeply angered the exhausted soldiers on the track, who maintained profound respect for the pragmatic commander who had undoubtedly saved their lives. The deeply demoralized Maroubra force was abruptly handed over to Brigadier Selwyn Porter during the campaign's most critical juncture. Despite the catastrophic defeat at Brigade Hill and the devastating loss of their highly respected commanding officer, the exhausted Australian troops refused to completely surrender. As they painstakingly consolidated their drastically thinned ranks upon the heavily fortified ridges of Iorabaiwa, a profound sense of grim, ultimate determination settled over the battered battalions. They clearly understood that there was absolutely no more highly defensible mountain terrain to strategically trade for time. We either halt these Imperial bastards right here on this bloody hill, or they take Moresby, a hardened veteran grimly explained to his squad. However, as the incredibly brutal delaying action finally neared its bloody conclusion, the fundamental logistical realities of the campaign decisively shifted in favor of the Allies. The Australian forces, now situated precariously close to their primary supply base at Port Moresby, finally received highly substantial reinforcements and crucial heavy artillery support. Field guns were painstakingly hauled up the incredibly steep, muddy inclines to provide devastating fire against the advancing Japanese lines. This massive influx of fresh troops, abundant ammunition, and desperately needed rations significantly revitalized the deeply exhausted defenders preparing for the ultimate clash. The relentless, deeply terrifying stage was now perfectly set for the absolute climax of the entire Kokoda Track campaign. Major General Hori, driving his severely starving and disease-ridden soldiers entirely through the sheer power of fanatical imperial discipline, aggressively prepared for the final, decisive push toward the coast. The fiercely entrenched Australians, heavily backed by newfound artillery support and fresh logistical supplies, stood firmly ready to absolutely annihilate the encroaching enemy vanguard. The ultimate, highly bloody fate of Port Moresby and the entire Australian continent would be violently decided upon the muddy slopes of Iorabaiwa. By mid-September 1942, the exhausting Japanese offensive reached its absolute geographical zenith at the heavily contested slopes of Ioribaiwa Ridge. Major General Tomitaro Horii had miraculously pushed his severely depleted South Seas detachment across the unforgiving Owen Stanley Range. The elite imperial soldiers, despite enduring unimaginable physical hardships, had driven the defending Australian forces perilously close to the southern coast. From these commanding mountain heights, the victorious Japanese infantry could miraculously observe the faint, tantalizing searchlights sweeping across the night sky above Port Moresby, their ultimate strategic prize seemingly within immediate, triumphant grasp. In a desperate response to this catastrophic threat, the heavily battered Australian Maroubra force executed a final tactical withdrawal across the deep valley to Amita Ridge. This heavily fortified position represented the absolute last line of geographic defense before the vital coastal plains of Port Moresby. Australian commanders explicitly ordered their exhausted infantry battalions to dig deeply into the muddy terrain, knowing firmly that any further retreat was strategically impossible. This is where we finally stop the bastards. Lads, there is nowhere else to bloody run. A hardened company commander grimly instructed his deeply traumatized men. The strategic situation at Amita Ridge fundamentally altered the previously disastrous logistical dynamics of the entire jungle campaign. For the first time since the devastating conflict began, the defending Australian forces possessed significantly shorter and highly efficient supply lines. Vital ammunition, medical necessities, and fresh food rations were rapidly transported from the nearby coastal base directly to the entrenched frontline troops. Furthermore, field artillery pieces were painstakingly hauled into position, providing the deeply exhausted Australian infantry with desperately needed heavy fire support against the looming Japanese positions stationed visibly across the treacherous valley. Conversely, the formidable Imperial war machine had finally exhausted its magnificent but entirely unsustainable offensive momentum. General Horii's aggressively extended supply chain had completely shattered under the immense geographical constraints of the merciless Kokoda Track. The highly disciplined Japanese porters, suffering from horrific malnutrition and rampant tropical diseases, simply could not transport sufficient rice across the towering mountain ranges to feed the vanguard battalions. The elite frontline infantry, who had brilliantly conquered seemingly impenetrable terrain, now faced the terrifying prospect of absolute starvation just miles from their ultimate strategic objective. The physical deterioration of the elite Japanese South Seas detachment rapidly accelerated into an unprecedented humanitarian and military catastrophe. Soldiers who were previously renowned for their terrifying physical endurance were suddenly reduced to emaciated skeletons clad in rotting imperial uniforms. Desperate infantrymen violently scavenged the hostile jungle for edible roots, leaves, and questionable fungi, frequently poisoning themselves in their maddening hunger. Debilitating outbreaks of virulent dysentery and severe malaria raged uncontrollably through the crowded, unsanitary Japanese encampments at Ioribaiwa, systematically decimating their previously unstoppable combat effectiveness without a single Australian bullet being fired. While General Horii desperately struggled to maintain his starving army, the Imperial Japanese High Command fundamentally altered its broader strategic priorities. The fierce, highly unexpected American amphibious landings at Guadalcanal in the distant Solomon Islands suddenly demanded massive redeployments of Imperial naval and aerial resources. Consequently, the crucial naval bombardment and coordinated aerial support promised to Horii for the final assault on Port Moresby utterly failed to materialize. The South Seas detachment was abruptly abandoned by its distant superiors, left entirely isolated and deeply vulnerable within the merciless Papuan wilderness. The intense tactical standoff between Ioribaiwa and Amita Ridge continued for several agonizingly tense days during late September. The heavily entrenched Australian soldiers cautiously patrolled the deep valley, thoroughly expecting a massive, suicidal Japanese banzai charge at any given moment. However, the terrifying jungle remained eerily silent, save for the pathetic moans of starving Imperial soldiers slowly succumbing to severe malnutrition. Australian artillery units continuously pounded the Japanese positions with high explosive shells, further shattering the fragile morale of the desperately hungry enemy troops, desperately clinging to the muddy mountain slopes. Slowly, the profoundly shocking reality of the Japanese predicament became highly apparent to the cautious Australian reconnaissance patrols. Combat engineers carefully navigating the treacherous ravines discovered abandoned Imperial weapons, heavily soiled bandages, and the horrific, unburied corpses of elite Japanese infantrymen who had simply starved to death. These deeply unsettling intelligence reports immediately reached the Australian High Command, fundamentally altering their strategic understanding of the battlefield. The seemingly invincible Japanese war machine had not merely stalled, it was actively rotting away from the inside out due to extreme logistical failure. Faced with the total annihilation of his beloved detachment through starvation rather than combat, General Hori confronted the most deeply agonizing decision of his military career. Despite being visibly agonizingly close to his ultimate objective, he recognized that ordering a final assault would merely result in the pointless slaughter of his weakened men. With profound reluctance and deep sorrow, Hori formally requested permission from the distant Imperial High Command to execute a temporary strategic withdrawal. The deeply humiliating reality of reversing his victorious advance undoubtedly crushed the proud general's fierce martial spirit. The highly anticipated response from Tokyo arrived via heavily encrypted radio transmissions, firmly authorizing Hori to immediately disengage from the Australian lines at Ioribaiwa. The Imperial Order explicitly mandated a tactical retreat to the northern beachheads of Buna and Gona to consolidate deeply defensive positions. The Japanese troops, completely exhausted and mentally broken, received the unprecedented withdrawal order with a profound mixture of sheer disbelief and secret relief. "We must march backward to survive, preserving our remaining strength for the Emperor," a hollow-eyed Japanese captain solemnly instructed his deeply starving infantry platoon. Under the terrifying cover of absolute darkness, the formerly unstoppable Japanese war machine quietly initiated its highly desperate retreat. Emaciated soldiers silently abandoned their meticulously constructed defensive trenches, leaving behind heavily rusted weapons and tragically unburied comrades in the suffocating jungle mud. The excruciatingly slow march back up the brutally steep inclines of the Owen Stanley Range proved vastly more agonizing than their initial victorious advance. The heavily demoralized Imperial infantrymen lacked the fundamental physical strength required to navigate the treacherous, mud-slicked trails, resulting in continuous, horrific casualties from sheer exhaustion. When the dawn heavily broke over the mist-shrouded valleys, the heavily entrenched Australian defenders cautiously realized that the overwhelming enemy threat had miraculously vanished. Reconnaissance units slowly probing the abandoned Japanese positions found an apocalyptic landscape of profound starvation and horrific disease. The sudden, highly unexpected evaporation of the immense Japanese pressure triggered a massive wave of cautious jubilation across the deeply exhausted Australian lines. The terrifying, months-long nightmare of continuous fighting retreats had finally concluded. The heavily battered Maroubra force had successfully held the absolute final ridge against unimaginable odds. The strategic dynamic of the brutal Kokoda Campaign instantly completely reversed. The Australian forces, previously desperately fighting for mere survival, were rapidly ordered to immediately transition onto a massive, relentless offensive. General MacArthur and General Blamey heavily demanded a highly aggressive pursuit to completely destroy the severely retreating Japanese army before they could successfully reach the northern coast. Freshly supplied Australian infantry battalions, heavily brimming with newfound confidence and righteous vengeance, aggressively surged forward, rapidly reoccupying the heavily soiled, abandoned trenches at Ioribaiwa to begin their ruthless, deeply unforgiving pursuit. As the advancing Australian troops slowly pushed upward along the highly treacherous Kokoda Track, they continually encountered deeply horrifying scenes of absolute human suffering. The muddy path was heavily littered with the decomposing corpses of elite Japanese soldiers who had simply collapsed from severe exhaustion and extreme starvation. The pursuing veterans frequently discovered desperate enemy stragglers, deeply delirious from severe malaria, pitifully clutching highly useless, rusted rifles. The previously terrifying Imperial warriors were now reduced to profoundly pathetic, heavily broken men, entirely incapable of offering any highly meaningful tactical resistance. The fundamental nature of the brutal jungle warfare had completely transformed from a highly desperate defense into a heavily mechanized, deeply punitive extermination campaign. Australian commanders fiercely ordered their advancing platoons to show absolutely no mercy to the retreating Imperial forces, remembering clearly the profound atrocities previously committed during the bloody defensive phases. The harsh jungle environment, which had severely punished the defending Australians weeks earlier, now actively functioned as a highly lethal ally, systematically destroying the heavily starving Japanese detachments as they desperately staggered backward toward the Northern Ocean. Major General Horii deeply struggled to maintain any highly semblance of rigid military order amidst the catastrophic collapse of his once proud South Seas detachment. He aggressively attempted to organize heavily fortified rearguard actions at highly strategic mountain choke points, desperately seeking to fatally delay the incredibly rapid Australian pursuit. However, his deeply emaciated soldiers lacked the fundamental physical energy required to dig deep defensive trenches or execute highly complex tactical maneuvers. The heavily battered Japanese rearguard units were continuously rapidly overwhelmed by the vastly superior firepower of the heavily advancing Australian battalions. The heavily triumphant Australian forces aggressively pushed northward, methodically recapturing the deeply blood-soaked ridges and deep valleys they had previously desperately surrendered. Each highly significant geographical milestone successfully reclaimed served as a deeply profound psychological victory for the exhausted veterans of the Maroubra force. The deeply strategic momentum firmly favored the heavily resupplied Allied forces, who were rapidly driving the broken remnants of the Imperial Army entirely out of the towering Owen Stanley Range. The previously terrifying threat of a massive overland invasion against Port Moresby was now definitively completely eliminated forever. The incredibly dramatic events that rapidly unfolded at Amita Ridge and Iorabaiwa represented a deeply monumental turning point in the vast Pacific theater. The heavily celebrated, seemingly invincible Japanese infantry had finally experienced a highly catastrophic land defeat. The magnificent myth of Imperial jungle superiority was utterly shattered by the deeply desperate resilience of the young Australian militiamen and the harsh realities of extreme logistical failure. This highly crucial victory heavily prevented the total isolation of the Australian continent, fundamentally permanently altering the massive strategic trajectory of the entire devastating global conflict. As October rapidly approached, the intensely bloody Papuan Campaign actively entered its deeply harrowing final phase. The heavily retreating Japanese forces desperately funneled backward toward their heavily fortified coastal beachheads, completely abandoning their magnificent dreams of immense continental conquest. The advancing Australian troops, intensely fueled by deep vengeance and highly efficient supply lines, aggressively prepared to entirely annihilate the deeply starving Imperial remnants. The deeply terrible death march had finally completely reversed direction, heavily ensuring that the deeply horrifying slaughter within the dark jungle would continue relentlessly for many bloody weeks. The immense sacrifices heavily endured by the brave young Australian conscripts during those highly terrifying weeks fundamentally saved their deeply vulnerable nation from absolute disaster. Their highly desperate delaying actions directly forced the magnificent Imperial Army to critically outrun its heavily fragile logistical capabilities. The deeply tragic saga of the brutal Kokoda Track would forever be intensely remembered as a highly defining moment of supreme national resilience. The highly strategic masterpiece executed by Brigadier Potts ultimately secured a deeply historic victory, fundamentally breaking the previously terrifying back of the massive Japanese offensive. The deeply horrifying cost of this highly pivotal tactical standoff at Iorabaiwa Ridge heavily forever scarred the deep memories of every single surviving veteran. The deeply treacherous, heavily mud-soaked mountain trails were fully saturated with the massive blood of countless highly brave young men from both warring nations. This deeply brutal campaign actively demonstrated the absolutely horrific extremes of human endurance when heavily pushed beyond all highly reasonable physical limits. The immense tragedy heavily unfolding within the deep Papuan jungle served as a deeply grim reminder of war's absolute ultimate savagery. Ultimately, the highly significant collapse of the immense Japanese war machine at Iorabaiwa proved that even the most highly disciplined imperial armies possess profound vulnerabilities. The heavily arrogant assumptions of the distant Japanese high command deeply shattered against the heavily fortified defensive lines of the deeply exhausted Australian infantry. The highly critical turning point in the brutal Pacific conflict was finally decisively secured not by massive naval armadas, but by heavily starving men fighting desperately in deep mud. The heavily brutal tide of the vast war had finally completely turned. As October 1942 commenced, the Imperial Japanese High Command fully recognized the disastrous reality unfolding in Papua. The fiercely contested American landings at Guadalcanal systematically drained crucial naval and aerial resources away from the New Guinea theater. Consequently, Tokyo formally ordered Major General Tomitaro Hori to immediately execute a strategic withdrawal toward the northern coastal beachheads. This highly humiliating directive officially marked the definitive end of the massive Japanese overland offensive. The seemingly unstoppable imperial war machine was now forced into a desperate, heavily agonizing retreat to avoid total annihilation by sheer starvation. The incredibly arduous reversal of the Japanese advance instantly transformed the treacherous Kokoda Track into a horrific avenue of absolute despair. The heavily emaciated imperial soldiers, severely weakened by rampant malaria and horrific dysentery, slowly turned their backs on the heavily coveted prize of Port Moresby. The previously glorious invasion force degraded into a deeply pitiful column of starving men desperately staggering backward through the suffocating jungle mud. Their carefully planned strategic withdrawal rapidly degenerated into a profoundly terrifying death march across the deeply unforgiving, rain-soaked peaks of the formidable Owen Stanley Range. Conversely, the highly reinvigorated Australian forces completely seized the immense tactical initiative with aggressive determination. Heavily reinforced by the freshly equipped 25th Brigade, the previously battered Maroubra force aggressively transitioned from a deeply desperate defense into a highly relentless, heavily punitive pursuit. The Australian infantrymen, intensely motivated by profound vengeance and heavily supported by highly efficient, deeply robust supply lines, surged forward into the dark jungle. We have these starving imperial bastards firmly on the run. Do not give them a moment of bloody peace. A highly aggressive Australian major fiercely instructed his advancing troops, while the unforgiving geographical terrain remained just as profoundly treacherous. The fundamental logistical dynamics had entirely reversed in favor of the Allies. The deeply exhausted Australian troops were now consistently sustained by highly reliable airdrops and the immensely heroic efforts of the dedicated Papuan carriers. The pursuing infantry heavily pressed the severely retreating Japanese forces, violently crashing into hastily constructed, deeply desperate imperial defensive perimeters. The once highly confident Japanese vanguard was continuously forced to fight highly costly, deeply agonizing rearguard actions simply to preserve the shattered remnants of their heavily decimated, deeply starving detachments. The heavily retreating Japanese fiercely attempted to establish highly resolute blocking positions at deeply strategic mountain choke points like Templeton's Crossing and Aora Creek. General Hori, desperately utilizing his last reserves of heavily fanatic imperial discipline, ruthlessly ordered his deeply starving soldiers to fiercely hold these heavily fortified ravines to the absolute death. The pursuing Australian forces violently collided with these heavily entrenched, deeply desperate defenders, resulting in highly brutal, deeply chaotic close-quarters engagements amidst the thick jungle canopy. The deeply terrifying cacophony of heavy machine gun fire violently echoed through the heavily rain-soaked, deeply mist-shrouded valleys. Despite fighting with deeply terrifying, highly fanatical courage, the heavily starving Japanese rearguards were systematically annihilated by the vastly superior Australian firepower. Freshly supplied Australian mortar teams and highly accurate field artillery continuously pounded the heavily fragile imperial trenches, completely shattering their deeply desperate resistance. The aggressively advancing Australian platoons violently cleared the heavily contested ridges, using highly aggressive flanking maneuvers and heavily concentrated grenade assaults. The heavily broken Japanese survivors frantically abandoned their deeply blood-soaked positions, desperately fleeing further northward into the deeply suffocating, heavily treacherous green hell of the deeply unforgiving Papuan wilderness. The complete collapse of basic logistical support pushed the highly disciplined imperial soldiers into deeply horrific depths of absolute human desperation. The severe lack of edible rations caused deeply widespread starvation, leading to incredibly dark, highly substantiated reports of organized cannibalism occurring among the heavily isolated Japanese units. Heavily delirious soldiers violently scavenged the heavily decaying corpses of their fallen comrades just to temporarily survive the deeply agonizing march. The previously highly honorable Imperial Army was completely reduced to a deeply tragic, heavily savage state of absolute primal survival amidst the deeply unforgiving, highly terrifying jungle environment. By early November, the highly aggressive Australian pursuit finally reached the deeply symbolic and highly strategic village of Kokoda. The heavily advancing infantry platoons cautiously entered the deeply abandoned settlement, miraculously finding the highly crucial airstrip completely deserted by the retreating Imperial forces. Raising the heavily soiled Australian flag over the heavily contested plateau provided an immensely profound psychological victory for the deeply exhausted Maroubra force. Capturing this highly vital logistical hub permanently guaranteed highly efficient aerial resupply capabilities, firmly ensuring the complete destruction of the heavily shattered Japanese forces remaining within the treacherous mountain passes. The absolute final major Japanese stand within the towering mountains occurred at the deeply treacherous, heavily fortified ridges of Oivi and Gorari. General Hori desperately concentrated his remaining combat-effective battalions to violently halt the incredibly rapid Australian advance. However, the deeply experienced Australian commanders brilliantly utilized highly complex, heavily coordinated flanking maneuvers to completely encircle the deeply desperate Imperial defenders. The ensuing highly brutal engagement systematically destroyed the last heavily organized remnants of the South Seas detachment, decisively transforming their deeply agonizing retreat into an absolutely chaotic, highly terrified route toward the deeply treacherous northern coastline. The deeply terrified, heavily fragmented Japanese survivors desperately fled blindly through the thick jungle, aggressively abandoning their deeply rusted weapons and severely wounded comrades. The highly cohesive Imperial military structure completely disintegrated into deeply panicked, highly isolated groups of profoundly starving men desperately seeking absolute salvation. The violently advancing Australian infantry methodically hunted down these highly pathetic, deeply emaciated stragglers, heavily ensuring that absolutely no highly organized enemy resistance remained within the heavily contested mountains. The previously highly magnificent Japanese overland invasion force was now entirely, permanently shattered beyond any highly conceivable measure of military recovery. During this utterly chaotic, highly panicked retreat toward the northern coast, a profoundly significant and deeply symbolic tragedy struck the Japanese leadership. Major General Hori, desperately attempting to rapidly navigate the heavily flooded, deeply treacherous waters of the Kumusi River, violently drowned when his highly fragile makeshift raft violently capsized. The sudden, heavily unexpected death of their highly respected, fiercely disciplined commander completely shattered the deeply fragile remaining morale of the heavily decimated Imperial survivors. The deeply tragic demise of the highly ambitious general perfectly mirrored the absolute, catastrophic failure of his highly disastrous Papuan campaign. The remaining heavily shattered fragments of the deeply starving Japanese army slowly staggered into the heavily fortified northern coastal beachheads of Buna, Gona, and Sanananda. They rapidly joined the heavily reinforced Imperial naval infantry units deeply entrenched within the highly suffocating, heavily diseased coastal swamps. The incredibly arduous, deeply agonizing mountain campaign had officially concluded, but the deeply horrifying violence was fundamentally far from completely over. The absolutely exhausted Japanese forces aggressively prepared to violently defend their highly precarious coastal enclave against the heavily advancing, deeply vengeful Allied military machine. The deeply victorious Australian forces, recently reinforced by heavily equipped but highly inexperienced American infantry divisions, aggressively surrounded the heavily fortified Japanese coastal positions. The deeply fundamental nature of the brutally violent conflict abruptly shifted from highly mobile jungle warfare into a deeply agonizing, highly static siege. The heavily desperate Imperial defenders had meticulously constructed deeply formidable, highly concealed coconut log bunkers deeply integrated into the heavily impassable, deeply malarial swamps. The advancing Allied forces now faced a deeply horrifying, highly bloody war of absolute attrition against an exceptionally deeply entrenched, highly fanatical, and deeply suicidal enemy force. The subsequent highly brutal Battle of the Beachheads proved to be profoundly more deeply agonizing and highly costly than the entire mountain campaign. The deeply frustrated Allied infantry continuously launched heavily concentrated frontal assaults against the profoundly resilient, heavily concealed Japanese bunker systems. The heavily advancing troops were violently mowed down by heavily coordinated, highly accurate crossfire from deeply hidden enemy machine gun emplacements. The severely muddy, deeply disease-ridden swamps became heavily choked with the deeply decaying corpses of intensely brave young men from both heavily exhausted, profoundly determined armies violently struggling for absolute tactical supremacy. Despite suffering incredibly horrific, deeply staggering casualties, The heavily determined Allied forces systematically reduced the deeply desperate Japanese defensive pockets through sheer, overwhelming attrition. Heavily coordinated artillery bombardments and highly courageous close-quarters infantry assaults slowly destroyed the profoundly resilient imperial fortifications won by agonizing one. The fiercely starving Japanese defenders, completely abandoned by their heavily distracted high command and lacking absolutely any highly viable avenue of escape, violently fought to the absolute bitter death. They absolutely refused to heavily surrender, so we must deeply bury them right where they firmly stand, a highly exhausted American captain grimly stated. By late January 1943, the profoundly violent, highly agonizing Japanese resistance at the deeply contested northern beachheads was finally, permanently, completely annihilated. The deeply horrifying, heavily bloody Papuan Campaign formally ended with the absolute, heavily catastrophic destruction of the entire Japanese South Seas detachment. The heavily victorious but deeply traumatized Allied forces firmly secured the highly strategic coastal region, permanently erasing the deeply terrifying threat of a massive overland invasion against Port Moresby. The previously highly arrogant imperial war machine suffered a deeply humiliating, highly decisive, and profoundly complete land defeat that heavily shocked Tokyo. The deeply immense strategic significance of the highly brutal Kokoda Campaign absolutely cannot be profoundly overstated by any highly serious military historian. The highly desperate, deeply magnificent delaying action executed by the heavily outnumbered Australian militiamen fundamentally saved their deeply vulnerable nation from highly catastrophic invasion. By violently breaking the profoundly powerful momentum of the deeply feared Imperial Army, the deeply exhausted Maroubra force highly effectively secured the absolute safety of the vast Australian continent. The highly terrifying threat of devastating aerial bombardments against highly populated southern cities was permanently, completely neutralized by their deeply profound sacrifices. Furthermore, the highly decisive Australian victory fundamentally completely shattered the profoundly intimidating myth of absolute Japanese invincibility in complex jungle warfare. The highly disciplined imperial troops, previously deeply considered heavily unstoppable in the suffocating rainforest, were violently proven to be highly vulnerable to extreme logistical failures and deeply resolute defensive tactics. The deeply profound lessons heavily learned upon the deeply blood-soaked slopes of the Owen Stanley Range heavily dictated the highly successful Allied military strategy for the absolute remainder of the deeply devastating, highly brutal Pacific conflict against the deeply formidable Japanese Empire. The heavily enduring legacy of the deeply harrowing Kokoda Track securely remains a highly profound testament to absolute, unyielding human endurance and deeply desperate courage. The deeply magnificent Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels and the highly brave, deeply traumatized young Australian conscripts permanently forged an incredibly unbreakable, heavily sacred bond amidst the absolutely horrific slaughter. The deeply silent, heavily mist-shrouded valleys of Papua forever deeply guard the highly tragic memories of those intensely fierce, highly terrifying months. The profoundly brutal Japanese death march was violently halted, highly ensuring that the free Australian nation would profoundly absolutely survive.